Israel's settlement, replacement of the two-legged beasts by a superior race, is probably significant. And incidentally, in the United States, it's not the right wing. You read this in Walt Whitman, for example, in Emerson, people like that. So there are plenty of reasons. I mean, they may not be good reasons, but they're certainly not insignificant. And when Israel goes against U.S. policy, the U.S. stops them, of course. The case I mentioned about attacking Iran is one, but there are many others.
Dr. Chomsky, I'm Jim Schneider. I sell the Herald and the Globe in front of a donut shop in Bunker Hill Mall in Charlestown. I was wondering if you had a chance to notice the October 6th article in the Oil and Gas Journal, which describes the delineation of some supergiant oil fields off the coast of Israel. Yeah. And they also say that it's an arc that goes from Syria, follows the coast of Israel, and then goes over to Egypt. And what's kind of embarrassing is to look at this full-colored chart on the first page, and there's a nice deposit of higher quality condensates under Gaza. But there's no reference in the article that the Palestinian Authority is going to have any access to whatever monies are derived from what offshore territorial rights they would have. I guess evidently they don't have any, because if you can have the Israeli Navy off the coast, well, you probably can't have your own oil field business. But they found 15 billion barrels of oil and 100 trillion cubic feet of gas so far. But nobody seems to mention it. It's about rockets, and it's about who killed whose kids first. It's not about dirty old oil, especially if it's a hell of a lot of it.
Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical. I didn't read that article, but there has been reporting, and not reporting, but there are plenty of studies about that, and it's been known for a long time that there are gas and oil, mostly gas, I think as you said, mostly gas resources off the coast of Gaza, not much off of Israel, or they would have exploited it. But I frankly doubt that that has much to do with what's going on. I mean, suppose that the United States stopped its rejectionism and permitted a weak, defenseless, unarmed Palestinian state to survive in accord with the national consensus. They'd have no trouble getting that oil.
Thank you, sir.
They don't have to let Israel conquer it to do. In fact, they'd probably get it more easily from a Palestinian state than from Israel, which is strong enough to have its own interests. So I doubt very much that that's a factor in what's going on.
Professor Chomsky, given the fact that there are dozens of schools in the Boston area and at least over 100,000 students that could pretty easily organize themselves, would you support an area divestment campaign, divesting university and college funds in those businesses that are doing business with Israel on the model of the South African anti-apartheid divestment campaign? And
I'm not hearing very well, I'm afraid.
Would you support a divestment campaign publicly on the model of the South African anti-apartheid?
South African boycott?
Yeah.
Well,
Naomi Klein has just come out.
That analogy is brought up a lot, but I'd urge you to pay some serious attention to the South African boycott. It was important, and it had an effect. But look at when it had an effect. There was an academic boycott of South Africa back in the 60s, but on very narrow grounds, because the universities were excluding blacks. Okay, so it didn't want to support racist universities, but that doesn't work in this case. The real boycott that began to be a mass movement with effects was mostly in the 1980s. That was after decades of serious education and organizing. It was at a time when American business was publicly opposed to apartheid, when congressional resolutions were condemning apartheid, when mayors were getting arrested, protesting this and that. By the time you had really mass public opposition to apartheid, yes, then you could have a boycott movement. But that preliminary work has not been done. And a call for a boycott is a tactical move. It's not a principled move. It's a tactic, And you have to ask what its consequences are. And I think if you think through the consequences before you've done the work, the educational and organizing work, that'd probably backfire. It'll be just, screams about anti-Semitism or support for Israeli atrocities and so on. So take a look at the history. It's worth looking at. Incidentally, by the 80s, it did get to the point where Congress passed legislation barring U.S. trade with South Africa. That's very different from where we are now, where Congress almost unanimously supports every Israeli atrocity that comes along, with Dennis Kucinich and 2 other people voting against it. Also, it's worth remembering that the Reagan administration violated the congressional legislation and, in fact, trade with South Africa